Before we open this cache of 20 declassified U.S. military records, 3 questions need an answer. How does a physical object travel at Mach 0.6 while its thermal signature reads cold, with none of the friction heat basic physics says it should be shedding? What does it take for an unidentified craft to jam a U.S. fighter jet's fire control radar and then vanish from every sensor on that aircraft in 33 milliseconds? And why do these incursions keep landing in the same narrow window as panicked guard frequency broadcasts from Iranian air defense? Here's exactly why intelligence analysts are asking those questions. October 27, 2020, 112 Zulu. A flight of F-16 over the Gulf gets a hard radar lock on 2 objects, 16.9 nautical miles out. They hold that lock, and then in the same window, the threat display lights up. 2 chevrons, active jamming. 1 frame, object present. 33 milliseconds later, gone, both objects. Off every sensor on the aircraft at the same instant. Hold on to that frame. By the time we come back to it, you'll have the answer to all 3 questions and everything that happened in the 4 years leading up to it. Welcome back to Nightshift Chronicles. I'm not interested tonight in loud theories or someone else's headline about a leaked document. I want the actual document. So tonight, we're opening 20 of them. Declassified U.S. military mission reports, range filer debriefs, in cross-verified sensor logs spanning 4 years in 2 of the most heavily surveilled combat theaters on the planet, the Arabian Gulf and Iraq, read individually. On the day each one was filed, most of these cases looked like noise. A blip a screener couldn't identify, a thermal reading that seemed off. File it, move on to the next tasking. That's exactly what happened 20 separate times to 20 separate air crews who had no reason to think they were looking at the same thing. But lay these files end to end in the order they actually happened, not by theater, not by which document happens to be on top of the stack, but by date. And something changes. A pattern that no single crew was ever in a position to see starts to become impossible to miss. It begins in the spring of 2020 in the waters between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. It ends 4 years later in the seconds between a missile's release and its impact over the Iraqi desert. In between, it crosses 2 theaters, 5 squadrons, and at least 20 separate crews who each thought in the moment that they were seeing something isolated. They were not. Let's go in order. Before you can call something anomalous, you have to know what normal looks like. And out here, normal is total coverage. This corridor between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Aden is one of the most watched pieces of sky and water on Earth. Naval search radar, satellite imagery, airborne electronic warfare platforms, all stacked on top of each other around the clock because roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz, and nobody with a warship in this water can afford a blind spot. That's the baseline you need in your head. Every case tonight punches a hole through it. The first loose threads show up in the spring, mid-May, a solid white object making what a range filer debrief calls erratic movements above the water, tracked, lost, and briefly reacquired at 4 times zoom. Early June, a 4-object formation observed directly beneath an aircraft in the Arabian Gulf, First one contact, then two more, appearing side by side 17 seconds later, then cloud cover swallows the whole formation before anyone can get a clean read. Mid-July, unidentified aerial phenomena logged at 3 separate times in the same shift, 1830, 1920, 2345 Zulu, at 3 different grid coordinates along the Strait of Hormuz. Early August, a single object transiting the strait while the crew is in the middle of routine Iranian naval monitoring. None of these alone would hold your attention for 30 seconds. A blip here, a reacquisition there. Standard no impact to mission paperwork. We're naming them anyway because in a few minutes you're going to watch this exact rhythm. Brief contact, ambiguous shape, no clean explanation, repeat itself in a different country 2 years later. And once you've seen it twice, coincidence gets a lot harder to say out loud. Then, August 24th, the pattern stops being ambiguous. North Arabian Sea, an MH-60R Seahawk crew from Helicopter Maritime Strike Squadron 73, call sign Battle Cats, is flying a surface surveillance mission at night. They visually acquire 3 small air contacts, round shape, what looks like wings or an airframe. Standard next step, cross-check the visual against every sensor suite on the aircraft. What comes back is one of the strangest single lines in this entire file set. Negative electronic support, negative radar track, negative IFF track. Let's actually sit with why that sentence stopped naval intelligence cold instead of moving past it. IFF, identification, friend or foe, is a transponder. Nothing showing up on IFF just means the object isn't announcing itself, which is unremarkable. Plenty of hostile or unregistered platforms stay quiet on purpose. Electronic support is a different animal. It's passive listening across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, tuned to catch the noise almost everything mechanical leaks out, a data link, a radar altimeter, even basic avionics chatter. These 3 objects leaked nothing, not a whisper, electronically silent, full stop. But the third line is the one that actually collapses the easy explanations. The Seahawk's onboard radar is sensitive enough to find something the size of a submarine periscope breaking rough seas. That's the whole point of the system. A solid object with wings and a fuselage reflects radio energy back to a receiver. That's not a design choice, that's physics. The same physics that lets air traffic control find a Cessna. A clear visual contact that returns 0 radar signature means one of 2 things: an extraordinarily small radar cross-section or a surface deliberately engineered not to reflect radio waves at all, visible to a human eye at close range, functionally invisible to the entire radio frequency spectrum. That's the baseline anomaly this whole story rests on. Solid to the eye, silent to the radio. Keep that phrase in your head. You'll hear its variations for the rest of this hour. Before we go further, it's worth answering a question you might already be asking. Why are we only seeing any of this now? For decades, military UAP reporting had no formal home. A pilot who saw something anomalous risked their career flagging it. There was no clean channel, no guarantee the report went anywhere but a drawer. That changed with the creation of a dedicated office stood up specifically to collect, investigate, and where possible declassify exactly this kind of sensor data without treating every witness like they'd lost their mind. The 20 files in tonight's episode are part of a rolling declassification effort out of that office. Mission reports and range fouler debriefs released specifically because the underlying sensor data no longer compromises the platforms or techniques that captured it. That distinction matters because it changes what kind of evidence you're actually looking at. This isn't a blurry cell phone video from a civilian on a beach. It's a fighter jet's targeting pod telemetry, a Reaper drone's infrared log, a Navy helicopter's onboard radar cross-check, instruments built, calibrated, and maintained specifically to identify hostile aircraft with as close to zero margin for error as engineering allows, because getting it wrong in that job gets people killed. When one of those instruments comes back with a return that doesn't match anything in its own reference library, that's not someone saw a light in the sky. That's a purpose-built detection system failing to close a case it exists specifically to close. Keep that distinction in mind for the rest of this story. Every case tonight comes from equipment designed to find real threats in the sky. Every one of them and every crew behind it ultimately came up short of an answer. A week later, on August 31st, sensors record the same signature in a different theater entirely, over Japan. 3 objects moving near each other at 18,000 feet, and the sensor operator flags one detail worth carrying forward. One object suddenly overtakes the others at, in the operator's own words, a much higher speed. Non-linear acceleration, mid-observation with no visible transition. We're flagging this Japan case even though it falls outside our Middle East theater because 4 days later, in the theater we're actually here to investigate, the exact same behavior shows up again. This time with a full sensor package behind it. September 4th, Gulf of Aden. An MQ-9 Reaper crew from the 172nd Attack Squadron acquires a round object at just under 24,000 feet and holds a stable sensor track on it for 8 straight minutes. 8 minutes doesn't sound dramatic until you know what a typical UAP sensor engagement actually looks like. Usually seconds, sometimes a minute or 2 before cloud cover or field of view limits break the track. 8 continuous minutes is enough time to check your own calibration twice over, enough time to rule out a sensor glitch, enough time to simply sit and watch a thing behave. And for those 8 minutes, this object moves at 277 miles an hour while making what the official log calls abrupt directional changes. Here's where the physics turns genuinely strange. The Reaper's infrared pod was set to black hot. Heat sources render dark on a display. Cold sources render bright white. At nearly 300 miles an hour, basic aerodynamics says this object should be shedding friction heat off its leading edges and thermal exhaust from whatever's pushing it. Instead, on the sensor, it reads as a solid, bright white mass, the coldest thing in the frame. The official record states it in 3 words: thermal, showed, cold, no combustion signature, no exhaust plume, a solid object moving fast enough to demand real thrust, radiating no more heat than the freezing high-altitude air it's punching through. 6 weeks after that, same stretch of ocean, same cold signature, another MQ-9 crew picks up another round, cold object, but this one isn't doing 277 miles an hour. It's crawling at 20. On its own, 20 miles an hour sounds unremarkable. Put it at 19,000 feet and it becomes a problem for anyone who's studied aerodynamics. Air that thin can't generate much lift, so a fixed-wing aircraft needs a fairly high minimum airspeed just to stay aloft. Drop below that stall speed and you don't glide, you fall. 20 miles an hour at that altitude sits well under any reasonable stall speed for a wing craft, and the log notes the object was still making abrupt directional changes against the prevailing wind while it did it, so it isn't simply drifting like a balloon caught in a jet stream either. Cold at 277 miles an hour in September, cold at 20 miles an hour in October. Whatever produced both of these readings appears to be operating outside the aerodynamic and thermodynamic rules that keep every one of our own aircraft in the sky. Before we go any further, let's do something most coverage of this material skips entirely. Let's actually test the boring explanations one at a time instead of just asserting they don't apply. Weather balloons. Balloons drift with the wind. They don't make abrupt directional changes against it the way the October 15th object over the Gulf of Aden did while crawling along at 20 miles an hour. A balloon also doesn't hold a stable radar invisible profile at one moment and a 277 mile an hour track the next. Balloons are a real common source of UAP reports. They don't fit these particular logs. Birds. This one's actually in the documents themselves. The May 6, 2022 Iraq case logged 4 contacts as probable birds in the same breath as the 5th, faster object. Birds explain a meaningful chunk of ambiguous radar and IR contacts worldwide, and to the analyst's credit, they used that explanation exactly where it fit. They didn't use it for the object moving at 277 miles an hour with 0 heat signature, because birds generate heat and birds don't sustain level flight at 23,000 feet for 8 minutes. Adversarial drones, this is the most serious candidate and worth taking seriously. Iran and other regional actors do fly drones in this exact airspace, but a drone has a physical airframe that reflects radar, a data link that electronic support sensors are specifically built to detect, and a combustion or battery signature that shows up on infrared. The August 24, 2020 case logged negative radar, negative electronic support, and negative IFF simultaneously on a solid visual contact. That's not what an adversary's drone looks like on these sensors. That's what stealth built at a level beyond currently known drone technology would look like, or something outside that category altogether. Sensor glitches or sun dogs. A glitch explains a single frame, a single log, maybe one bad sensor run. It doesn't explain the same signature, cold, silent, solid, recurring across 5 separate years, 3 different squadrons, and 2 different aircraft types, all independently reaching the same, doesn't match anything we know. Conclusion, without comparing notes with each other in real time. None of that proves what these objects are. It's not supposed to. What it does is close off the explanations that would let you file this away and move on. The same way the analysts writing these reports, one file at a time, close them off first. If you're someone who'd rather sit with the raw sensor logs than someone else's headline about them, that's exactly the show we make every week. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and you won't miss it when the next declassified cache lands. Because next, we're going back to that frame we opened on, October 27th, the jamming. the 33 milliseconds. Here's a deep dive into these incredible sightings. By late October, the character of these encounters changes. Everything up to this point has been passive, cold, silent, watched from a distance. This one pushes back. 11221 Zulu. A flight from the 77th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron is directed by Air Control, call sign Kingpin, to identify unknown contacts. The crew gets a radar lock at 16.9 nautical miles and slaves their targeting pod to it. What resolves on the screen? Two metallic reflective objects, one slowly circling the other, each showing a red, blinking strobe, a confirmed visual tally in the crew's own terminology. And in that same window, according to the debrief, the aircraft's threat receiver logs 2 chevrons, active noise jamming. I want to be precise about what the document actually says here because it's tempting to fill in the gap yourself. The report documents a sequence, a radar lock, then jamming. It does not on its own claim the objects were reacting to being painted. That's a reasonable question. It isn't yet a documented fact, and we're not going to pretend it is. What is documented is what jamming like this requires, mechanically, regardless of what triggered it. Something has to detect that is being illuminated by a specific fighter's fire control radar in real time. It has to read the exact frequency and pulse pattern coming at it, and it has to generate and transmit enough power on that same frequency to bury the fighter's own receiver in noise. That's not a passive metal skin, and it isn't wreckage or debris drifting on a current. Whatever produced that reading was carrying an active, powered electronic warfare capability operating inside a monitored military combat zone. Now, the skeptical read, and it deserves airtime because we'd rather rule it out than ignore it, is that noise jamming on a fighter's threat display can sometimes be triggered by mundane sources. A friendly aircraft's own countermeasures, pod misfiring, a ground-based jammer with nothing to do with the visual contact, even a hardware fault in the receiver itself. The debrief doesn't rule every one of those out explicitly. What makes this case harder to wave away is the timing. The jamming indication appears in the same narrow window as the radar lock on 2 visually confirmed, physically tracked objects, not before the crew arrived on scene, not after they'd broken off. If it's a coincidence, it's a tightly timed one. And then, the moment we opened this episode on, targeting pod video runs at 30 frames a second, frame 1, both objects visible mid-orbit. Frame 2, 33 milliseconds later, the log states both objects vanished from every sensor on the aircraft simultaneously. To physically leave a targeting pod's narrow field of view in 33 milliseconds requires acceleration that would tear a titanium airframe to pieces and kill any pilot inside instantly. Hundreds, potentially thousands of Gs. Sustained for a fraction of a second, most human instruments can barely register. Taken at face value, the record here describes a 4th-generation fighter's radar lock defeated electronically, followed immediately by a kinematic exit that sits well outside anything we currently build. We'll say it plainly, this is the single most extreme file in tonight's set. It's also, notably, the only one where the objects appear to actively counter a weapons-grade sensor rather than simply evade or ignore it. Keep that distinction in your head because it's going to matter again in about 20 minutes. There's a second pattern threading through these files, and it isn't about physics. It's geopolitical, and it starts 2 months before that October engagement. August 27, an MQ-9 from the 482nd Attack Squadron is tracking a formation of unidentified objects moving northeast to northwest along the Gulf Coast. 2 minutes into that track, at 0532 Zulu, Iranian Air Defense issues a guard call. Guard frequencies 1 to 1.5 for civil traffic, 2 for 3.0 for military aren't background chatter. They're monitored continuously by every asset in the region, and a transmission on guard means a sovereign air defense network has flagged an unidentified track it considers close enough to its own airspace to say something about it out loud on a channel everyone can hear. 3 years later, that exact pattern repeats, and this time it's paired with the cleanest kinematic data in the entire 20-file set. 0145 Zulu, Iranian Air Defense hails a U.S. aircraft on guard. Maintain safe distance from border. Less than an hour later, at 0241 Zulu, an MQ-9 from the 50th Attack Squadron tracks a solid object, thermal signature logged as cold, moving at 320 miles an hour. 40 minutes after that, at 0322 Zulu, a second object, same cold signature, is clocked at 440 miles an hour, roughly Mach 0.6, with the infrared pod reading no more heat off it than the empty sky around it. We want to be careful with how we frame this pattern, because it's the kind of detail that's easy to oversell. We are not telling you these objects are Iranian, and we are not telling you Iranian Air Defense is tracking the same contacts American sensors are. The declassified record doesn't support either claim, and we won't make it for the sake of a better story. What the documents do show, twice, 3 years apart, is unidentified objects and a sovereign guard call arriving inside the same narrow window, inside one of the most heavily armed, most closely watched strips of airspace on Earth, in a corridor where a single misread radar return has historically been enough to trigger a real military response. That kind of timing is worth taking seriously on its own, even without a theory attached to it. Think about the actual environment this is unfolding in. You have a sovereign nation on a hair-trigger alert posture, painting its own air corridors with search radar and issuing warnings over an emergency channel, monitored by everyone in the region. At the same time, American crews are confirming their own position well inside international airspace and threading through the middle of that standoff. Solid, radar-quiet, heatless objects are moving at Mach 0.6 through the exact corridor both sides are watching most closely. Neither side put those objects there. Neither side can explain them. But if an Iranian surface-to-air missile operator already primed to expect an incursion mistakes an unidentified formation for an inbound strike package, or if a U.S. crew mistakes a guard call meant for something else as a direct threat to their own aircraft, the unidentified object itself never has to fire a shot to become the reason two nations end up in a shooting engagement neither one intended. That's not a hypothetical dreamed up for this episode. It's the specific, narrow kind of accident modern military doctrine spends enormous effort trying to prevent. And these files put it on the record happening in the same airspace, on the same nights as some of the strangest sensor returns in the entire Declassified set. It's worth pausing here to say plainly, none of what you've just heard is the first time trained military crews have logged something like this. In the closing years of the Second World War, Allied bomber crews over Europe reported small glowing objects pacing their aircraft at altitude. Fast, silent, and apparently unbothered by evasive maneuvers. Crews nicknamed them Foo Fighters, and intelligence officers at the time genuinely investigated them as a possible enemy weapon, before concluding they didn't match any known German or Japanese technology either. Through the Cold War, the pattern shows up again. Interceptor pilots vectored onto radar contacts that outperform their own aircraft and then simply aren't there anymore by the time gun cameras roll. What's different about tonight's files isn't the behavior, it's the instrumentation. A 1944 bomber crew had eyes and a logbook. A 2020 Seahawk crew has multispectral targeting pods, radar cross-referencing, and electronic support suites capable of detecting a whisper of stray radio noise from a mile away. And even with all of that added precision, the conclusion lands in the same place it did 80 years ago. Unidentified. That continuity matters. It means whatever's driving these sightings isn't a byproduct of noisy modern sensors finally catching up to something that was never really there. If anything, better instruments have made these cases harder to dismiss, not easier, because every advance in detection technology has simply confirmed in higher resolution that something keeps failing to match anything we've built ourselves. By 2022, the theater shifts west into Iraq, into the ongoing coalition mission against ISIS remnants known as Operation Inherent Resolve. This isn't open sky either. It's some of the most densely monitored airspace on the planet, layered with signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, and armed patrols flying every single day. And it's here that the pattern from the Gulf picks back up. Quiet, ambiguous, easy to dismiss. At first, May 6, 2022, a U.S. asset conducting target development under heavy dust storm conditions that were already limiting ground visibility logs 5 objects crossing the frame in the same mission. One gets a possible missile visual recognition. The other 4 are logged more mundanely as probable birds. It's a genuinely ambiguous file, the kind of report that's easy to close without a second look. We're including it anyway because of what it starts. 2 weeks later, a single object is tracked heading north-northeast at 18,000 feet. The friendly aircraft is fully mission capable. Its sensors are working exactly as designed. The screener follows the contact as long as the mission profile allows, and still can't reach a positive identification, not unidentified because the equipment failed. Unidentified because the object simply didn't match anything in the reference library. December 1st, an asset supporting task force operations directly over Baghdad tracks a possible UAV or UAP moving west to east across the airspace of the Iraqi capital itself. The crew doesn't divert to investigate. They're tasked with tracking high-value individuals and armed convoys on the ground, and that mission takes priority. But the object is there in the official log, transiting one of the most politically sensitive skies in the entire country, and nobody follows up. None of these 3 cases taken alone would carry a single minute of this episode. That's the point. They set the same low-grade baseline of ambiguity the Gulf logs opened with back in 2020. A blip, a shrug, a file close. Then, 4 months later, the sensors in Iraq stopped being ambiguous the same way they did in the Gulf 3 years earlier.
Contact. Multiple bogeys. Track that target. What's the speed? It's holding steady at 18,000. No visible propulsion. Advise.
March 31st, 2023, a two-ship of F-16CMs, call sign 1.4A, is flying defensive counter-air in Killbox ESSA, northeast Iraq. At 23:02:05 Zulu, the flight observes several bright objects maneuvering quickly, west to east. Not one, not two, somewhere between 10 and 20. The F-16S are flying at flight level 265, 26,500 feet. The objects are logged at flight level 600 plus, above 60,000 feet, more than double the fighter's own altitude, in air thin enough that sustained power flight up there pushes past the operational ceiling of nearly everything we fly. Using the sniper targeting pod in TV mode, the flight holds a track on the objects for roughly 20 seconds before they dim and drop out of the pod's field of view. And in those 20 seconds, the crew does something worth pausing on. They deliberately slew the pod onto a nearby star and compare the two returns side by side in real time. 1.4 of flight compared targeting pod between POSS UAP and STAR. Results were different. That's an analyst actively ruling out the simplest explanation on the spot rather than assuming it. It isn't a star, it isn't a sensor artifact mismeasuring a celestial body. It's a distinct physical return, somewhere between 10 and 20 of them, holding a formation the report specifically notes these pilots hadn't seen in any of their prior sorties over the same airspace. And notice what these objects don't do here, because the same thing is true almost everywhere else in tonight's file set. 2 U.S. fighters obtain a sensor lock at extreme range on a swarm of unknown craft directly over an active combat theater, and the objects simply continue on their own course. No jamming this time, no evasive break, no reaction at all to a 4th-generation fighter's targeting system locked onto them from below. Whatever they are, they don't appear to register 2 F-16s as a threat worth responding to. There's a second detail buried in this file that's easy to skip past because it's not as flashy as an altitude number. The formation itself. 10 to 20 separate contacts holding a shared heading in a shared altitude in a configuration the crew explicitly notes they hadn't seen in any previous sortie over that airspace. Coordinated formation flying at any altitude requires either a shared guidance system linking every unit together or independent platforms sophisticated enough to maintain relative position with each other without a visible means of communication, no radio traffic, no data link, nothing that shows up on an electronic support scan. A flock of birds can hold a loose formation using instinct and eyesight. 10 to 20 solid radar-bright objects holding position above 60,000 feet in air too thin for most birds to survive in the first place is a different category of problem entirely. Whether that means 20 individually intelligent platforms or 20 components of a single larger system, the declassified file doesn't say. It's simply one more question the unidentified stamp on this report is quietly holding open. September 20th, 2024, al-Asad Airbase, the same installation that took direct Iranian ballistic missile fire back in January of 2020. Inside a restricted zone codenamed Raindrop, a U.S. strike asset is running a weapons calibration. A weapons systems officer and combat systems officer release an AGM-176 precision munition and track it toward its target on MX-20 and MX-25 sensors. The AGM-176 is a small precision-guided munition built for exactly this kind of calibration exercise, accurate, low yield, and designed to be tracked start to finish on sensor so crews can verify guidance performance before it's ever used against a real target. That tracking is the whole point of the exercise. Every second of that munition's flight, from release to impact, is supposed to be a clean, uneventful sensor feed with nothing else in the frame. In the seconds between release and impact, a window that lasts only single digits of seconds, a solid object crosses directly through the sensor's field of view, moving at high speed. It's thermally intense enough to overwhelm both sensors and throw a full IR lens flare, a heat bloom strong enough to momentarily blind optics built specifically to handle high heat sources like munition impacts and jet exhaust. And buried in the middle of that flare is a detail that's easy to miss on a first read. The log flags it as, quote, unknown at this time whether an object detached itself from the primary UAP before it exited the frame. Here's where this particular record gets strange in a completely different way. If you go looking for this file by its official cover sheet title, you won't find it easily because the label on that cover sheet reads simply East China Sea. But every operational detail inside the report contradicts its own title page. The coordinates 38 SKC55 sit in Iraq. The unit involved, the 16th Special Operations Squadron, was deployed in Iraq. The restricted zone, Raindrop, belongs to Ain al-Asad, thousands of miles from the Pacific Theater, printed on its own cover. This happened in the heart of CENTCOM's area of operations. We'll give you both honest explanations for that, because we don't know which one is true. The first is simple human error. The department processes an enormous volume of files during a declassification push, and a database tag from an unrelated Indo-Pacific case could plausibly get attached to the wrong report by accident. The second is more uncomfortable. Mislabeling the geography while leaving the coordinates technically accurate satisfies the letter of a declassification requirement, while making the file nearly invisible to anyone searching by region or keyword. We can't tell you which one happened here. We can tell you that if you only read a cover sheet and never check the coordinates underneath it, this file effectively doesn't exist. And after all of that, the lens flare, the possible detachment, a solid object flying straight through a live munitions flight path in a restricted zone, the official conclusion stamped on this file is a single word: benign. How does that word survive contact with what's actually written above it? Because in military classification, hostile has a narrow, specific legal meaning, an overt act, firing on friendly forces, painting them with a targeting radar, attempting to ram an aircraft. This object did none of those things on the record. It didn't fire. It didn't lock on, so by the letter of the system, it isn't hostile, regardless of whether anyone involved actually understood what it was or what it was doing there. It's easy watching this as a list of coordinates and thermal readings to forget there's a person behind every one of these 20 files. Somebody had to sit down after each of these missions in a debrief room and write the actual words, not possible atmospheric phenomenon, not something vague enough to disappear into a filing cabinet, words like negative radar track, negative IFF track, or unknown if an object detached itself, knowing exactly how that sentence reads to whoever has to sign off on it above them. That's not a small thing to put your name on. These are combat aircrew, not UFO enthusiasts. People whose entire professional training is built around identifying threats correctly, quickly, and without embellishment, because the cost of getting it wrong in that job isn't an argument in a comment section. It's a wrong decision made at 300 miles an hour. Writing unidentified instead of forcing a label that doesn't fit is, in its own way, an act of professional honesty that took more discipline than picking the comfortable answer would have. So, somewhere behind that Killbox ESSA report is a wingman looking at his own targeting pod, comparing it against a star and choosing to write down that they were different, knowing exactly how that would read to an intelligence officer skimming 200 other files that week. Somewhere behind the al-Asad file is a weapons systems officer watching a lens flare wash out a sensor mid-strike and choosing to log a detail as strange as possible detachment instead of quietly leaving it out. 20 files. 20 of those moments. None of them dramatic to watch from a debrief chair. All of them are the reason this episode exists at all. Lay these 20 files end to end in the order they actually happened, and one thread runs through nearly every single one, from that first cold contact in the Arabian Sea in the summer of 2020 to the lens flare over al-Asad 4 years later. With one exception, these objects never react to us. No evasive maneuvers when a search radar sweeps them. No change in course when a 4th generation fighter obtains a hard lock. The way the Killbox ESSA swarm didn't so much as flinch. No flares, no chaff, nothing resembling a defensive response. Right up until October 27, 2020. When something in that file appears to answer back. That's not a contradiction in the record. It might be the most important variable in it. Whatever produced 20 near identical baseline behaviors also produced exactly one exception, and the document don't tell us why. That underlying consistency is itself the finding here. It's what's left standing after analysts, file after file, spent their time ruling things out instead of ruling things in. Weather, known adversarial drones, sensor ghosting, celestial objects, conventional aircraft. That elimination process is exactly why these cases get stamped unidentified instead of quietly closed. Nobody in these files is claiming to know what these are. The paperwork simply runs out of other explanations before it runs out of instances. One more thing before we close the file, and we want to be completely upfront that what comes next isn't written in any of these documents. It's a question the timing raises. It is not a conclusion the record supports. The September 2024 object crossed the sensor's field of view in the exact window between a missile's release and its impact, a window that lasts only a handful of seconds out of an entire mission. If that timing was coincidence, it's a remarkable one. If it wasn't, it raises an uncomfortable possibility that flying through an active weapons corridor at that precise moment isn't indifference at all. It's observation. watching in real time exactly how one of our own munitions behaves from inside the engagement itself. We don't know that's true. Nothing in these 20 files proves it, but once you've laid the timeline out end to end like this, it's the kind of question that's hard to unask. Here's what I'd ask you to actually take away from tonight, though, not the theory, the discipline behind it. Every analyst whose name is redacted out of these 20 files did the same unglamorous work. Rule out the balloon, rule out the bird, rule out the drone, rule out the sensor fault, and only then write down the word nobody wants to write down because every easier word had already failed. That's not showmanship. That's the slowest, least exciting kind of rigor there is, and it's exactly why these files are worth more than a viral headline built on a single, blurry frame. So, if you take one thing with you when this episode ends, let it be that instinct, the refusal to stop at the first explanation that lets you stop thinking. Whatever is actually flying through the cold spectrum, we found it tonight the same way those analysts did. Not by guessing first, but by running out of easier answers, one file at a time. Which file in tonight's set unsettles you more, the 33 millisecond disappearance over the Gulf, or a live fire missile corridor getting a visitor with impossible timing 4 years later? Or maybe it's the possible mislabeling of the East China Sea. Tell me which one and why in the comments. I read every one of them. And if a solid object reading cold at 440 miles an hour unsettled you tonight, wait until we go to outer space. We will research all the Department of War trances we find from NASA. This should be fun, and I hope you will join us by hitting that subscribe and notification. Until next time, stay awake, stay curious.